Okay, well, welcome to our, what are we on? Our third week of subcommittees, right? Yeah, third. And I, our agenda this week is very, very simple. So I will just share it with you because bringing it up is not even worth the paper. We're just simply going to report on what we all had some homework to read some of these foundational documents that we keep talking about. I sent out some assignments. Maybe some of you were overachievers. Maybe some of you didn't get to all of it, but I think I'd like to have a discussion about kind of what we saw and how it related to those questions, that list of questions that we've come up with, that list of things we want to learn more about to get to the bottom of what our recommendations are going to be for school safety. So I think that's going to be the bulk of our meeting, of our time together this week. And then we can decide where we want to go from there to set our agenda for the next week. With that, just by a quick show of hands, were folks able to at least dig into this a little bit? I did mine. Yeah. Okay. Erin, were you able to get to any of it? Dati? I just don't want to be jumping down anyone's throat if you didn't have a chance to do any of it, that I don't want to call upon you. So I'm wondering if anybody is feeling strongly about sharing what they learned in digging into those. Is anybody like, I went through and took some notes so that I can share on the MOU, but did others, Moises, did you have some just kind of you want to start us off?
Yeah, I want to thank you for giving me the largest of the readings.
You're welcome.
Actually, I had already read all three of them, and so it's good for me to review it again. But basically, for me, yeah, it's a very good report.
Which one did you read? Remind me.
Yeah, the striving for equity.
The voices for Utah children. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah, and we work well with Anna, and who's one of the authors, and yeah, I mean, we support a lot of that. But it's statewide. It's not really specific to Salt Lake City. And then most of those areas of contact, points of contact they talk about, are really could be addressed through juvenile courts and juvenile justice services. Only the very first arrest are really through PD. But really, for me, I don't know what we can do with it because it is a state level. It isn't specific to Salt Lake City. I think the other two for sure are awesome, perfect for our group, but it's too large. The only thing I was thinking maybe some of the recommendations that they talk about, I think those are pretty good too. Still kind of general, but I like that they were positive about that stuff. So that's what I thought.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question because I read all three sort of. I only got through the beginning of that one. I ran out of time. So I was encouraged as I was reading that one at the beginning where they really did dive down in particular into the disparities in outcomes for children of color, and that they had some, it seemed like they were leading towards some additional recommendations towards doing better at that. And so were those recommendations you're talking about that you think are maybe applicable to the work that we're doing?
Yes, some would be harder because they're like work for state level, like UBJJ and the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee and stuff like that. So that really wouldn't be specific to us, but there's some recommendations like for parents and communities, like what could we do basically at more of a community neighborhood level.
Mm-hmm.
And so something like that, I think we could look into and develop it towards Salt Lake specific rather than Utah in general. But again, they're still kind of broad, but maybe we can use that as a template.
I'm going to put you on the spot one more time and ask what difference. I mean, I know that it's a statewide report, so the data that's in there is obviously just a little broader than we would need it to be. But are there other
A lot broader.
Yeah, are there other reasons why you see that that's less applicable Is it because of the rural nature of the rest of the state versus our urban nature, or what, how do you see it? The recommendations being too far away from Salt Lake, and
Oh,
I
no,
get,
no, not the recommendations, but the data itself. So
okay,
again, the recommendations are pretty
got it.
broad.
Okay.
But yeah, the data is statewide, and a lot of the work that they're talking about is what once they're in the system, what juvenile justice services, what the juvenile courts can do, which is all relevant, totally support it. But Salt Lake here, we're not going to be able to tell JJS or the courts what to do. And the trends may be identical. They're showing like what Nicole had talked in the past, that and we see this across the country. This fits the natural the literature on this, national literature on that. Many times we do reduce arrests or whatever points of contact, but that disparity stays there. That disparity is so hard to us to get rid of, and I think it's because it's a culture change. There's a lot of factors related to that, not just training, not just one policy. So they'll go down, but then that disparity is there, and sometimes those disparities even get bigger. In that, white, more privileged youth will be able to get like diversions more often than the others. But in the positive way, those are going down, so that's always a win. But the disparities stay, and that's the hard part.
I see.
And so is Salt Lake different than the rest of the state when it comes to that? I don't know. We don't have that data specifically to what they're talking about. But if it fits the general trend of the whole country, I could see where that may be also an issue. But I do like the recommendations. Again, they're broad, and maybe that's something that we can use. Like, they talk about mentoring youth. Definitely I totally believe in mentorship, especially if we could train mentors on how to mentor. You don't just put people together and go at it. It's a skill to have as well.
Okay.
So yeah, and talking about ACEs, mental health and those type of things, totally supported. But all that data, yeah, I don't see it specific to Salt Lake.
Did anyone else read that Voices of Utah Children, the Striving for Equity report? Did anyone else dive into that and have things that they want to share? Nicole?
Yeah, I read it a while ago during the blackout, but my thought was initially that I think even though it is statewide, a lot of that can be extrapolated to Salt Lake because we are the largest urban area, then Ogden next, of course, and Provo following. So even though the rest of the state is very rural, I think there is a lot of that data that we can extrapolate and use. And of course, we can't tell JJS or the juvenile court what to do. That's definitely way beyond our ken for sure. But we can influence how we can use that data to look at policy and how to change that policy and give us some backup to show the rest of the community and the city and Salt Lake City Police that we're not just making things up. We're not making up disparities, that these disparities are present, and the first contact that a child has with that system is law enforcement necessarily. So I think we can extrapolate quite a bit from it. I don't think it's a lost cause, and I do like the recommendations as they apply to the city specifically.
Nicole, I don't think Salt Lake City, especially Salt Lake City PD, is gonna say, "Oh, that's what's happening around the whole state." Okay, that's proof that that's what we're doing. We actually even go to agencies, school districts, or police departments, sheriff's offices, and we bring them data. And even then, they're like, "I don't think that data is right." So to come with statewide data.
No, I get that. But what it does is we're not going to try to convince them that they're wrong and what they're doing is wrong. That's not the best way of going about it. What we're saying is this is our recommended policy change. And we'd be taking it to probably the mayor and to Chief Brown saying, this is our recommended policy change. And this is part of our reasoning why. It's not that you have to accept this data as truth and being representative of what's happening in your department and your jurisdiction, but this is why. This is part of our reasoning. This is our basis. And I don't think it's completely off board to be able to say that. And they can reject the data all they want. It really matters. I think any agency that wants to dig in their heels is going to ignore any data that is presented to them, no matter what it looks like. It's hard to face the truth. But I think this is just basis. We don't say this is the only basis, but it is some basis for it. They can take it or leave it, in my opinion.
So
Sure.
then why have data if it doesn't matter then?
I think it does matter. I mean, I've done a lot of these types of groups on lots of different subjects, and data. Oh, it always is a contentious point because it can be looked at a lot of different ways. So I think certainly we don't want to rely solely on data, but let's I would say, as a constructive next step, let's look at how we can supplement the data we do have, if we can get to other sources and other ways of building that data that it may feel more credible to you, Moises, or to others. Let's make sure we can, if there's ways ways that we can gather some of that, let's think about that. Did anyone else dig into that report at all?
I did read it. I read it originally when it came out, and then I did review it yesterday. And I'm really pleased that the bulk of the report, or throughout the report, there's a repeating theme of the appreciation in the positive changes that have been made. There's a lot of positivity that's come out of 239 and the juvenile justice reform, including that overall the numbers are going down. Obviously, as shown in the data, the disproportionality continues to persist, and the recommendations to continue to dig into why that persists is critical. I think, though, I just want to go back to how 239 removes so many of those low-level violations from the jurisdiction of the courts if they happen in schools. So some of the data in there, and even some of the data as it relates to Salt Lake, will not necessarily apply to the school system because they cannot make those arrests with low-level violations there. So I think there's a limit on how much that report can help us specifically on this committee, because the officers are already not making those reports. And I think as we look at the number of citations in the next section, assuming that we go in that order out of the specific data, I mean, those citations are down by hundreds, and which is good, which means that communities of color are having fewer arrests, but the disproportionality persists, which is obviously not okay, right? So we need to continue to drill down into that. And just from my own experience, having worked on these issues before, and maybe Davina has some background on this, but one of the reasons that about 5 years ago now, Salt Lake City initially chose to look at that relationship of the SRO and the school administrator is because that disproportionality also shows up in the discipline data of the schools. So how many the kids of color are being sent to the office, and then that was potentially being criminalized, right? So there's a partnership with the school district here that I think is critical on why those kids are going to the office in the first place. And then to the third piece of what we're going to talk about today, the MOU, those officers are being asked still to make arrests on those low-level violations, even though they're not in jurisdiction of the courts anymore, and it's prohibited by the MOU, right? So those officers are actually showing the document to the administrators saying, that's not appropriate for you to ask me to do that, right? So I think if we look at all three of these things together, there's some positive change there, but we still need to drill into that disproportionality.
Yeah, which for me, that was my biggest aha reading all of these things, is how much work has preceded our work, how much attention and kind of thought has gone into this before, but that there is that remaining disparity that's still not acceptable and still needs to be addressed further. But I think to your earlier point, Nicole and Moises, I think that's really the most important data to work from, to say, yes, look at all this wonderful, path forward, but our work represents closing that remaining gap that still exists and is still real and is still impacting members of our community. So I think that was a big aha for me. Anyone else have thoughts on that first report? I had some specific notes on the MOU that I went through, but I know others went through that as well. How about the MOU? Did anyone who's on the call have a chance to go through that? Dati, do you have thoughts you want to share with the group on the MOU you went through?
Yeah, I know you went through it as well, so it's probably a lot more thorough than what I was able to do. But something that I thought was really important was it lists that I think, as Steve said, about school resource officers making arrests in case of things that are technically criminal, even for when it's legal if adults do it, but criminal when students do it. For example, possessing alcohol on campus, right? That in that circumstance, technically the MOU says that school resource officers are able to make an arrest because that goes against the law. And so I don't know, I think that clause specifically enables the school to prison pipeline because the student is literally being arrested. I know that you technically can't add too much detail to an MOU, right? Because that makes it a lot harder for school resource officers and administrators to make the MOU even function. But there are just like a couple of things that I thought might need more detail, like what constitutes a real and immediate threat? Like, what does that mean? I think maybe just more context so that I can understand what that means. And then when they ask for administrator input, what does that mean? And then the responsibilities that fall to the administration, for example, telling school resource officers when they're dealing with students that are special ed or have a disability, where does that fall into if there's an emergency, right? Like if there's an emergency and you don't have time to contact administration, then what's going to happen, right? Especially if you're dealing with a student who's part of special ed. And so those are just a couple of things that I saw. So that's all. Thank you.
No, that's great, Tati. And you zeroed in on a lot of the things that I also saw in there. And I think that your questions, and that was also my experience, is that it brought up more questions than it did, but it also answered a lot of the questions that we had identified. And so did anybody else take a look at that? I don't want to steal anybody else's thunder with my note.
I actually have a couple things to say. So when I was reviewing this, going over first the data and the research, I looked through and I tried to see if there was anyone involved that was Native to contribute and be a part of this collaboration when putting together the studies. I didn't see it unless there was someone else that saw there was some Native contribution to this, because that's very important when trying to gather this type of information. And why I say that is because when I was the Indian Ed director at the Salt Lake City School District, one of the biggest findings that I had when I was registering students, and also our students are under Title VII in terms of funding, and the basically how many students, Native students we had in the school district was the equivalent to what funding I was to receive under the Department of Indian Education. And there was a significant amount of students that were actually Latinx. They were identifying themselves as Native, and that was something I had to work with the school district, but I had to basically call a lot of families that were not indigenous, so they are not native to this area, so they weren't tribes from this area. And so and it took a lot of work to do that, and just to bring that clarification, because the funding needed for our Native students was very important. When I got into the program, we were only $30,000 to support our students in the school district. And by the time I was done, you know, I was able to bring about 100,000, close to 100,000. But another thing was our SRO. Like there is that distrust with police officers. We know that across the board. But for Native families, they won't even come to schools, or they won't even come to the district if they wanted to see me because of that hesitancy. And so when you hear SROs, basically it's like, we don't want to talk to them. I mean, they already basically labeled my child as a person that will not, succeed or anything like that. So I was thinking, why not have that collaboration or that MOU with the Indian Ed coordinators there across the board with any district, because they need to begin that development of trust and support in that aspect. And so that was another area I wanted to discuss about. And maybe I didn't see that in the MOU, but I think that's another form where they need to start that relationship in terms of, I guess, also under the guidelines of restorative practices.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that we will have a lot to insert in that, because I didn't see a whole lot of reference to Native communities. I mean, except in the police data, they basically just said that they don't count them. Isn't that right? Whoever else read the police data, it was that they didn't have, is that right? That they didn't have,
Didn't
I
have
think it's
data
Hispanic.
on Latinos.
yeah,
They included them with Caucasian white kids.
yeah, it was
Hispanic, Middle Eastern.
Middle Eastern, and there was one more. I thought it was,
I think
it was Polynesian versus
Polynesian as well.
Polynesians were separated out. There was a separate section for Islanders, but there was nothing for anyone else besides Islanders, Black.
I'm gonna ask, actually, maybe that's an ignorant question, but is there, like, what is that distinction between Polynesian and Pacific Islander? Can somebody please inform me?
It's I thought it was the same, but it did combine Asian and Pacific Islander in the same.
It specifically called out Polynesian, yes, Pacific Islander, so I wasn't sure if there's a distinction there.
Yeah, Pacific Islander actually encompasses a whole huge group of anyone from the Pacific. Polynesian is very specific to Tongan, Samoan, Fijian, Maori. So there's like five groups within that are Polynesian.
So-
And then
so
we have like other, yeah. And then, but Pacific Islands encompasses everywhere, which is Micronesia, Melanesia. So all of that area is
Okay.
all Pacific Islander.
So Pacific
But
Islander is a
very-
broader term, and Polynesian is a more specific term.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I didn't know that distinction. Okay, well, I will, just to tie us back to the questions that we all, and Davina and Anna Pacey, I think you weren't with us last week, but thank you for catching up. And we did add a couple of things to our kind of list of what we want to focus on in this subcommittee. And I will share my notes, but I will say that they are not at all perfect. So don't judge my note-taking skills, but just to run through kind of what I saw in what I read and how that it addresses the specific things that we wanted to address in this subcommittee. So if you can all commit to not judging my note-taking skills, then I will share them so that you can kind of read along with what I have here. Where it's not letting me grab my, oh, there it is. This is it. Is that right? No, sorry. It won't let me find the file that I'm trying to find, so apologies for that. If it will do this, if I can. I don't know if anybody else is with me, but I keep everything open on my desktop all day long. I'm a multi-tab, application person. So let's see if I can find, here we go. Okay, so tied specifically to the questions that we asked are, can you see this? I know it's a little bit small, but I did find some data based on, so things, and again, to what Date was asking, I feel like I came up with a lot more questions. So here, so who is the safety for staff or for students? And it does talk about that in the MOU, but it seemed pretty like school staff, school visitors, parents, and students. So it does outline that in the MOU, and they call that the school community. it seemed pretty generic. And the reason I put this here is because that they're required to collaboratively develop a school safety plan, each SRO per the MOU. So I thought it'd be interesting for us to see some examples of if those are public. I'm not sure, maybe Moises or Steve, you could tell us, but if those are public documents, I think it'd be interesting to see what comes up in those, because it would be telling about that relationship between the administrator and the SRO and how that's planned for each school. And if that's actually happening, I think that could also be a good outcome indicator to see if people are actually following the MOU and creating those. Then where are the referrals coming from? I think that we've talked about this a little bit, but that MOU was specifically devised to further delineate that the school administrator has to get the SRO involved, except for a couple very specific cases where the SRO can act unilaterally, which were some of the things that Dati was talking about what specifically does that mean when you're talking about an emergency situation or emergent situation. So I think I like that the MOU addresses that, but it does also bring up some more questions. And in the system to register complaints, there is one, at least according to the MOU, that there's a committee that reviews this, and they're meant to create a yearly report. And I think, I'm not sure if I copied this part, but they meet by twice a year, this committee. So I would be interested to see some of the outcomes of that. I don't know that we have that information in our hands about how those committees happen and if they're happening. Moises, have you seen that?
No, that was one of my main questions when I saw that, because I thought maybe that report that we got from PD was that, but it's not. It's from PD only.
Yeah.
So yeah, one is it happening, and two, what does that look like? So
Yeah,
definitely.
I would love to see that as well. Dati, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, I saw that as well. And then, but when the head of the SRO, I don't know, committee or whatever, they came to the school board meeting and they directly told us that they had no complaint system, which makes me think that this is maybe not happening, or that there's no, like, this doesn't outline a direct way where there's like a Google Sheets or a forum where students can submit a complaint. I don't see that. So maybe that's a good question.
Yeah, so maybe this area is really ripe for us to dig in, because perhaps it's not happening or not clear enough that people are able to execute on it. So I think we can ask that person if if we can see some examples of this or if it's happening. So it's provided for in the MOU, but how that's actually happening is still a question. And then I thought it was interesting to look at what the training that's outlined in that MOU is meant to address, which it's a pretty long list. And Moises, I know that you've been involved in some of this. Do you know, is this still happening? Is it happening? What do you know about that?
Yeah, so we provide trainings for the SROs throughout the state. For every school district, any school district that has SROs, that they have to go through this training because of legislation. And so just because you've gone through it once doesn't mean you're done, because you may have new SROs, you may have new school administrators, so they're supposed to go through it as well, anybody that's new. They are starting to work on it to see if, okay, once everybody's more or less has got this training, what's the upkeep? What's the sustainability of something like that? And I'm going to tell you what, that's a lot of topics there. There's no way we get through all those topics.
Yeah,
and so what some school districts have done, and Salt Lake City has been pretty good. Granite's been really good about. We will, once you provide that training, we will also continue to bring other trainings that fit this list. Because they believe in it, but there's not funding from the state to here. Boom, we'll provide you 40 hours of training for everybody. That's a lot of work and a lot of money.
Okay, yeah, because this list, I mean, I like the list, but it did make me wonder if how much of it is actually covered, because that's a lot. As
Yeah.
someone who does trainings, that's quite a bit.
And
back in.
also with Salt Lake School District, a lot of them do that. And definitely when we do the training, we try to find the MOUs from the school district and PD. But what they do also is they also do specific training just on the MOU.
Mm.
What does that look like? And sometimes it can get pretty heated because you know, something like what Dati was bringing up, exigent circumstances, which maybe Steve could explain better. Things like that, you know, and a lot of times there's not going to be a black and white answer. Okay, so what's the protocol? And you know, what's the best practice? There may not be a law for it, but what is best practice? And a lot of times, you know, things are dynamic. And so what does that look like then? And so that's where it gets gray and kind of messy.
Yeah, and sometimes in that messiness, I mean, I did have I called the attorney Mark Cottrell. I called him just to ask a couple of these questions, and I mean, he sent me the policies, which I'll send to all of you, the policies that are specific to the SRO, which I don't think we've had before, or at least we haven't talked about in this group. So he did send me those, but it struck me that, you know, probably our recommendations, there's a lot of recommendations in this MOU, and there's a lot of things in policy, and perhaps we need to think more broadly about the implementation and how we can help the rubber meet the road a little bit, because there's a lot of these policies and recommendations and things floating around. And if we can get a little further down the line and helping to guide that implementation or helping to give useful ways to implement this better, because a lot of the intentions here seem really good, really positive, at least to me.
And as you know, culture takes a while. Any institutions get to take a while to fully turn. I so far have seen a lot of positives from law enforcement throughout the state, but that takes a while.
Yeah.
You know? And you know, this document isn't going to have it all. In 10 years, we're going to be going, man, I can't believe we didn't put this.
Yeah, that's so true. And to exactly what Dati was saying is that there's a lot of stuff here, but there's also a lot of questions that brings up, and maybe that could be where we focus our energy on trying to further give the committee the resource, or the SROs the resources they need to do their jobs as they're meant to be done, according to some of these documents. So I'll go through the rest of this very quickly. How do they get hired and assigned? There was quite a bit of information in the MOU about that. It seems like it is a real mixed set of responsibilities between the city and the school district and the police department. So they're city employees, because the police are city employees, everybody. And so they're city employees. City provides a lot of the stuff they need to do their jobs, but the police do the hiring and firing. And specifically further down, I won't torture you with all this stuff because I copied quite a bit out of the MOU. I won't torture you with all of that, but that there's an SRO supervisor that's meant to stay in touch. And I think that's the person that you heard from before I was a part of the process, with the idea of getting feedback from the school administrators so that they can include that in their performance evaluation, which assumes there is a performance evaluation that's being conducted. So it does sound like there is an evaluation. What goes into that, I still am not entirely clear on that based on this. But I did see there was a provision in there about that the school administrators have to let the SRO know if a student has an IEP or is disabled. But I didn't, tied to additional questions, I didn't see, and I'm not sure if maybe this is included in the definition of disabled, but I didn't see specific reference to mental illness, and that felt a little nebulous. Moises?
I think that's what they mean, especially when they, yeah.
Okay, because anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole. And there was a lot of references to de-escalation, etc. But there was, I was looking, there's a head of this program, and I'm not sure if it's the same person who is the SRO supervisor versus the person who is the like over all of the SROs from an executive point of view. Do you know, Moises or Nicole? Is that the one and the same, or are those two different people?
There's two. In some cases it's the sergeant, and in some cases it's the division chief. And it references both of them.
Yeah, it does. And there was,
Times.
I'm having trouble finding it. Oh, police bureau commander. Is that different than the SRO supervisor? Yeah, those are the two people you're talking about, Steve. Police bureau commander.
Yeah, so there's a line supervisor who's a sergeant, who's directly with the officers. And then there's that upper administration who's the bureau commander. And those are two separate positions.
They said that's who polices the officers. And so, and then the genesis of the SRO program, at least according to the MOU, and from what I'm inferring from some of this is that the genesis is different than the purpose now, because it was so long ago in the 80s when they set it up, that purpose, that reason has evolved over time, perhaps. But the mission of the SRO is to provide for and maintain a safe, healthy, productive learning environment while acting as a positive role model for students in the school district by working in a cooperative, proactive, problem-solving partnership between the police department and school district. It sets forth guidelines, blah, 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 but maintaining safe schools, improving school climate, and supporting educational opportunities. So there's a lot of just buzzwordy stuff in there. So it'd be interesting to hear the what's behind that a little bit. Moises?
But yeah, but what I like about it is that they're staying away from the law enforcement role.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not all about, get criminals and keep this place safe and let's harden this school. For me, I see a lot of educational language in here of saying your role here is that positive role model.
Mm-hmm.
It's much bigger than this little safety issue here.
And maybe this is a ignorant question, but to me it brought up, is it really just the difference between, okay, when we have an incident, we could call the police, but the police they don't understand our community, they don't understand our culture, they don't understand what happens at this school. So is it really just that? That's what because it seems like with the number of incidences are very low now over time. So it still made me question, do we still need these officers? Do they still have a function? If the number of instances are that low and we could just call the police, is it just to prevent that misunderstanding that could happen in that moment of whatever instance, because this person is really dialed into what's going on in the school versus whatever officer would show up otherwise?
Well, yeah, with that question, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Moises. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, but that's a double-edged sword, right? By saying, well, there's not crime here anymore, then what do we need cops for? That for me is saying the assumption to have a cop in there is to deal with crime and delinquency, and I think what these guys here are saying is that's not their primary role. Mm-hmm. That is a very important role in case there's an active shooter or something really bad happens, but really it's to be able to be part of this community, to be that positive role model, and which I would like, because that's a big part of my mission, is to improve those relationships between law enforcement and community. But that's only if that happens. And of course, if it's not happening, then that's a different story.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Nicole, did you have something to add to that?
Well, yeah, when I was reading through this, my question when I was reading it was, what is being done here that a social worker can't do? I mean, no, they can't arrest, they can't stop and frisk, they can't detain a child who's perhaps posing a threat to themselves or others. But for the most part, it really felt like a lot of the SRO's function could be completed by trained social workers. And they wouldn't bring the same sort of stigma that a law enforcement officer would bring with them. I mean, sure, we do need to work on improving public and law enforcement relations. I think that is definitely important, but it did make me wonder what all these things are what social workers are trained in already. So you don't have to do any additional special training for them. It's what they're already trained to do. It's what they've spent their life being educated in, and they have to continue to do CEUs to keep up their certification. So that was a big question for me when I read through the MOU, was besides the minor tasks of searching, frisking, arresting, detaining, why do we have a law enforcement officer when we could have a social worker, especially in an elementary school,
Yeah, and I think it is worthwhile for this group to talk about, is that trust issue, because is the trust issue, is this the place to work on that, or is there other places to work on that? Or, I mean, I don't have an opinion on that. I'm not inserting an opinion on that, but I think it's an important, it's a kind of a critical question to the work that we're doing, is building that trust. And if that's the case, then at least I didn't see a metric tied to that. I mean, certainly we're looking at those couple of things, those incidences, the arrests and things like that. But I didn't. Maybe Dati, maybe you saw something I didn't. But is there a metric to say, like, trust is up or trust is down, or is there a way to see if this is actually being effective at that? I mean, the language indicates that maybe that's some of the intent, and I appreciate that, Moises, but I'd be curious if that's actually helping. And I know that's a tricky thing to measure for sure. And I'll just stop sharing this in a minute so we can all see each other better. But the record
Hey,
of
Steve, can you answer Nicole's question?
With the social worker? Yeah, got so many thoughts, and while people have been talking, I've been flipping through the document for some of the issues that we've been talking about, and I promise that I read them in there. I'm just having trouble finding, because I highlighted everything in a red pen. So first off, I think social workers have an amazing place in schools, and I think they can be incredibly helpful. And I don't see this as an either or conversation. I think I'm not really comfortable with just minimizing what a police officer does in a school to stopping and frisking and narrowing it to that. I think that because the nature of crimes that officers will be involved in a school are serious, and they're potentially violent, and they're at that higher level, that if they're occurring there, administrators are aware of it, they're more than likely going to have to call in a police officer anyway. So to have an officer who already understands the school district philosophy on working with kids and using these de-escalation strategies and using restorative practices and just conceptually trying to use the least amount of law enforcement possible to resolve an issue in school, I think is critical. Because one thing, and Mo mentioned this earlier, with some of the friction that occurs in the training with the officers and the school district folks, is that in some ways this school district document raises the floor of what a police officer can and can't do. So in other words, because of this agreement with the school district, the officer is going to be less involved than if they were just involved with the same situation on the street. And I think that's important, particularly in that section where it does talk about drugs and alcohol, those issues where the youth is impaired, and they may need to be under the jurisdiction either of a police officer or that school administrator to get a parent there. There's a conversation required between the officer and the district employee, the administrator, to resolve that. And there's further restrictions in the SRO section that the officer should use the lowest level of intervention possible, right? Which Salt Lake's case is often a peer court or just a referral back to the parents, right? Whereas if it were an officer off the street, they wouldn't be bound by this document. So that's one reason it's important to have conversation about that relationship with the officers in schools. So and then thirdly, and I probably feel more strongly about this than what I'm hearing articulated from other members of the board. But that relationship between law enforcement and the community has to be developed. It has to be improved. And one awesome place for that is working with kids, right? And if you do it appropriately, and I understand and agree that it's been done inappropriately in the past, and these are efforts to continue to move that forward. But I think it's important that it's there because it is going to improve those relationships and the legitimacy of policing for generations. And I also want to acknowledge what Davina said about families feeling uncomfortable coming to the school because there's law enforcement presence there. There was an example where when at a particular school, when visitors were arriving, they were directed to go to the security office, which is non-law enforcement, but just happens to share with law enforcement, right? So of course that would be off-putting to families, certain families who had distrust towards law enforcement, versus just going straight to the office, right? And I think that, so I understand that those things occur, but if we're careful about the way the officer operates at the school, and they are in that mentoring role, and they are in that supportive role, they can do so much positively for the kids and not only be pigeonholed into that strict law enforcement responsibility, which, as Mo articulated, and I agree, this document is trying to get there. So those officers aren't just in that, saw a bad guy arrested, same kind of mentality, that they have this more broad rule that I think is good for law enforcement. I think it's good for kids. I think it's good for community in addition to these other areas. And I think social workers have a great place in the school also. So I don't see that as an either or.
Okay.
So thanks for listening to my detail.
Well, thanks for giving us your thoughts, because I think you have some experience that the rest of us don't. So I think that all perspectives are really good on this. The last thing I'll share from this that I also thought was an important thing for us to dig into was what we talked about, how they get qualified to do this job. And this is what the MOU says about that, is they have to be a commissioned officer with at least 2 years of experience. And these next two are very subjective. They need to have an even temperament and be a good example and possess good communication skills that will enable them to function effectively within the school. And that struck me as maybe a place that that's open for us to look a little more closely at, is because I know that especially when we were talking in the full commission about accountability and both knowing whether somebody has sort of a negative record or has had a lot of negative incidents, and do we track those positive incidents as well? If that turns out to be a recommendation of that group, I think that could extend to our group to say, that this person has a record of positive interactions, rather, to have something a little more concrete in that area to draw upon for the SRO program, to say this person has a demonstrated record of having really positive interactions versus the other. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that.
I do. I think that, hope I didn't just cut anybody off. So when I read that, it occurred to me that's a good place for a profile review, right? Because I think we were talking last week about whether there's a list of complaints or something that probably only the law enforcement side would be able to look at that, but they would do that policy review. But here's an issue that I think needs to be improved in law enforcement, and there's not a place to document positive interactions, right? So there's not a positive list. Hey, you did a bunch of good things, because that doesn't get written down. Only if you get in trouble does that get tracked, and obviously that should. So that positivity becomes kind of a reputation thing, kind of a word of mouth thing in the department that would be better if it could be quantified. But at the very least, look at negative side, the complaints that are there and complaints that are substantiated. And if there's a pattern of not working well with children, probably not a great person to stick into a school, right? So at least there's that piece.
Absolutely. We have about 7 minutes left, and I know several of you leave to join the 5 o'clock meeting, which I think is still, one is scheduled after this. I'm not sure if it's the one that you all typically attend. So I do want to be respectful of time. With that, where do we feel the next, I mean, we've read or if you haven't done the reading yet, I would say do, because I mean, it was very illuminating to me to read these documents just to understand the background of what we're talking about here. So even if you didn't, we'll still count it if you do it for next week. And also, what is our next step? What do you want to dig into a little further based on what we talked about today? What feels right for our next conversation?
Did we get a chance to look at the Salt Lake City specific data?
Oh, no, we didn't look at the Salt Lake City specific data. I did a little bit, but who else looked at that? Nicole, did you? I see you shaking your head. Yes. Anyone else?
Yeah, I reviewed this with the Human Rights Commission, I think last year when it first came out. So it's been, I briefly reviewed it again, but I can say the things that jumped out to me were that after, there was a definite before and after effect you can see from the House bill that changed JJS pretty significantly, which was nice. But there was still, I noticed, well, the one thing that really troubled me was that there was no specific designation to ethnicity with Latinos. So that did trouble me, that we don't know how Latinos were affected by this. And Latinos are the largest minority group in Salt Lake City. So I think, and the Human Rights Commission did let Salt Lake City PD know we want to have that data. We want that to be differentiated. So Salt Lake City PD already has that marching order from the Human Rights Commission. But the other thing that jumped out at me is the schools that have a minority population definitely had more citations than other schools like Beacon Heights and Dilworth. So that was the big thing that stuck out at me. So there's still a bit of a disparity. And of course, we don't have the new data out yet. This was for 2013 to 2019. And I'm not sure when the next report will be released.
I'd like to know that as well. And I would be interested in kind of subdividing the data over time, because it certainly, like, there's been so much work done in recent years that some of the data, that was what struck me when I was looking at that. I'm like, some of this data feels like we need new data to work from, because there's a lot of things that have transpired and it's hard to really extrapolate thoughts based on the data that's there. I mean, it's good to know, and the trends are certainly illuminating and useful, but other than that, anyone else thoughts on that?
But it's 2019 data.
But it's 2013 to 2019 data.
Yeah. So what is it that you want? I didn't understand.
I was just saying, because so much has happened between 2013 and 2019. I mean, some of it is parsed over time, and you can see that trend line. But
yeah, 13 to 19, it's like every year, boom, 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 boom.
Well, yeah, but then it ends at 2019. So
yeah, and so it's very 2020.
It's for 2018. So we should be able to have the 2019 data. So it ended with January 2019. So that's what I'd be interested in knowing is, well, especially
for me,
the differentiation with Latinos. Can we differentiate between that?
I agree.
I totally agree with that.
I agree with that, because also the one thing is here for Native community in Salt Lake City Valley, we're increasing population. You know, a couple of years ago we were at 10,000 families. Now we're way over that. Another thing too is, I think the thing, I didn't go into depth with that because I'm still trying to look at the MOU. I mean, right now, no one, I don't think, really knows what ESA is, the Every Student Succeeds Act, for the Office of Indian Education, that was enacted in 2015. So basically, school districts are responsible for how our children are being, whether it's going to be in graduation rates, how SROs are coming into support, or IEPs, special education, all of that. School districts are not really well informed on that. So tribal leaders basically could go into these school districts, and because there's that MOU between wherever there's going to be a Title VI Indian Ed director for Native students, they are responsible with how they're going to engage with tribal leaders because of the funding that's going to these school districts. So SROs, all of that, that's a big key factor. And that was something I tried to to stress to the district when working at the Salt Lake City School District, like we have a responsibility in how we're going to create the MOU, but yeah, I'm still going to go off on that MOU, but yeah, I haven't really looked at Salt Lake City yet.
Yeah, and I think that is, I appreciate your focus on that, Davina, because I didn't see a whole lot of reference to that. So perhaps that's also an area that we can identify as a potential for change, to insert that into this conversation and include it in ways that it's not included now. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to. I see that we still. I mean, this is a conversation I know we're all so passionate about that we could talk about it for hours and hours. But because you all told me you wanted to stay to an hour, I'm going to facilitate you to an hour, and I'm going to hold you to your own decision. So with that, I want to see if you are okay. I can take Cindy Lou's notes, who's being so nice and taking notes for us, and just look at these areas that we're talking about that perhaps we can dig a little further into. Our questions from last time, we talked about some data needs that we didn't have answers for. Those have been forwarded to the police department, and they're getting us written answers. They originally were going to send a couple officers to give us answers, but I said that our group we decided we weren't ready for guests just yet. And so they're going to provide us some written answers. If those come through during the week, I will send them out to all of you for your consideration. And I will also send the policy document, and we'll call that kind of informal homework if you want to go through, because that's really one of our opportunities to recommend, where it is firmly within our scope, is to recommend changes to that policy document. So I will send that out, and let's just all, if you can find the time to please go through that. I think that'll be really good. And I'll take Cindy Lou's notes and really clearly identify those areas that we've talked about, at least today, as opportunities for change. And then perhaps that's where we can pick up our discussion next meeting. That's just based on what I'm hearing, that feels like a logical next step. How does that feel to all of you? Okay. And I want to recognize that we do have two observers today. So Sherry and Sanj, if I didn't butcher your name, I apologize. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your interest in our subcommittee. So we always appreciate when members of the public are here to listen in. So,
would it be good to have the Salt Lake School District attorney who did the MOU either talk to us, or you could talk to her? So
I talked to Mark and a little bit.
No, the school district, not the city.
School district one. Yes. And again, I sort of have a running list of people that we could talk to. Do you feel like we are ready to have somebody come and give us some of the school district's side of this equation? Is that part of
I'm asking the group. I don't know if they're ready for it or not, if it would be good or not.
Do we want to do that?
I think it might be a different attorney. I thought this last year they switched the contract to a new set of attorneys. So I don't think we'll get the original attorney for the school district.
So you don't think it's Christina anymore?
Still there, right?
I don't believe so. I think it's a new firm.
Yeah, a firm. Well, I know she's still there. I just don't know if she's in charge of that or not.
Yeah, actually, and I'm not sure who would have been in charge of that.
I will find
It was
out.
Christina.
That's good.
Yeah, so Christina Kendall was the attorney at the time. If she's still there, I think it'd be a great perspective.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, if she's not under contract, it could be questionable whether she's available to speak to us, if that's still her role. But I will look into that and get us an answer on whether that's appropriate to hear from her, or if that's even possible.
And maybe one more question before we break the meeting. That issue with gathering the data on Latinos was, as I understand, due to checking the box on the report system where you have a pull down screen on what you can select, and so it was not represented. I'd be curious. I know there was work being done on that, and to Nicole's point, it's been demanded before. Can we have someone with the city reach out to the department and see what the status of that is? Because if that's not there, I think we should push it, and if it is there, it'd be great to start being able to get that.
Okay, we'll put that on the action items list to add, because they're already in process of answering our questions from last week. So hopefully we can throw these additional couple questions in there and get our answers sooner rather than later. So I will commit to at least submitting that question. So with that, I know that many want to join our next meeting, so I don't want to make you too tardy for that. So I will send out those things. Thank you everyone for being here. If at any time you want to revisit the hour-long meeting, I am wide open to that discussion. But for now, I will facilitate us to the 1 hour meeting. And thank you everyone for doing your homework and for your continued commitment to the work. So thank you very much. And we will see you at our next meeting, which is next week. Or is full commission next week?
Sorry, Siobhan, it's actually regular commission next week. And so subcommittee would be the week of Thanksgiving. It'll be that Wednesday before.
Okay, thank you, Cindy Lou. That's why I didn't have at my fingertips our next meeting. So in 2 weeks, we'll see you.
I just checked the website. Christina Kindle's still with the school district.
Oh, excellent.
It'd be great to have her perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, I will check.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
everybody. We'll see you.